Welcome back to video lecture number 4 on the presidency. The last time we ended with foreign relations and the idea that the presidents have the authority to enter into agreements with foreign nations. And again, you see here President Obama back in his first term meeting with then Russian President Medvedev, trying to work out a treaty called START, which is to reduce ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. So presidents have the power to do that, but they need the advice and the consent of the Senate. So again, we're back to that idea of balance and hedging in the powers of the president. And in this case, all formal treaties signed by the president need to have 2/3 of the Senate also voting in agreement. And again, that's a high threshold these days, maybe not historically, but today that's almost impossible to get 2/3 of the Senate to do just about anything. One of the most famous examples of when the Senate rejected a treaty signed by a president was at the end of World War I in 1919. President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, went to Paris to work out and participate in the peace negotiations. They did so successfully, at least according to Wilson, and he brought the treaty home with him. It was known as the Treaty of Versailles that formally ended the war with Germany, the main aggressor nation, although Austria-Hungary was another one of them. And the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty despite Woodrow Wilson's attempts to persuade and cajole the Senate to accept his treaty, despite Woodrow Wilson's trips across the country by train at that point, trying to speak to the public directly, something that presidents do when they have an idea or an issue they care very deeply about. They'll go right to the people. Of course, today that's much easier in the age of television, internet, and social media. But in 1919, 1920, it wasn't as easy. But Wilson took his case to the people, but the Senate stood steadfast in its rejection of the Treaty of Versailles because they argued, and the Senate was controlled at the time by the Republicans. So we see this political divide. When one party controls the Senate, it's going to be very difficult for a president to actually get his ideas passed. And in this case, the Republican Senate in 1919 and 1920 rejected the treaty. They said it was a violation of the U.S. Constitution because it would give the League of Nations the power to declare war on behalf of the United States, something that only Congress can do. So they rejected the treaty, and the United States did not enter into the League of Nations, which was, if you don't know from history, the predecessor to the United Nations. And there's lots of things we could say about that, but this was a major defeat and an embarrassment for Wilson. And so we see this happening. The other thing that presidents can do, however, to avoid the Senate is to sign executive agreements. So these are agreements that have the force of law, but they only remain in place as long as the president is in office. So yes, a president can forego the formal treaty route and sign an executive agreement with another nation. That does not require Senate approval, so that gives the president some power here. And again, we see that balance, that seesaw that the founding fathers created, giving the president powers, but limiting them. And so it becomes a crazy and confused picture. One of the recent examples of an executive agreement goes back to the 1990s and President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, who signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That agreement is still in effect today, although President Clinton is no longer our president, and that's because Congress did, in fact, then approve that agreement. So it became a congressional executive agreement, which is still in place today. And the North American Free Trade Agreement regulates trade amongst North American nations, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Caribbean nations, and nations of Central America, to promote the idea of free trade. And it's been, I think, widely a successful treaty, though some still have doubts about it because it may have taken jobs and relocated them to Mexico or other areas in Central America where labor costs are significantly lower. However, the deal did go through as an executive order. Another thing that presidents can do is receive ambassadors and also extend diplomatic recognition to other countries. And this is another famous example of this was in 1948 when President Truman, a Democrat at the end of World War II, formally recognized Israel as a nation by recognizing their government. And that was incredibly important to Israel. It was a new nation in 1948. Somehow I hit the pause button by mistake. I'm back talking about the idea of foreign relations and the president's ability to extend diplomatic recognition to other nations. 1948, I don't know why I want to say 1848, but 1948, President Truman, a Democrat, recognized the nation of Israel and its government, and that was incredibly important. At the time, Israel was surrounded by hostile Arab nations. You will be studying that next year in 10th grade. And our presence and our support and recognition was really fundamental in the survival of the state of Israel in 1948, and that continues until today. The United States also was involved in the breakup of ex-Yugoslavia in the 1990s, extending recognition to Slovenia and to Croatia. Important steps that presidents can take in the realm of foreign policy. So there they do have ample powers and broad powers. So let's move on to power number 6, Commander-in-Chief. And here's kind of a funny picture of President Obama dressed up as a general. This is obviously not a real photo, but it's been photoshopped. But it does give you the idea that the president is, in fact, according to Article 2, Section 2, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States and of the militia of several states when those are called out by presidential order. Now, what does that mean, Commander-in-Chief? Well, again, here we see the Founding Fathers at work. It means that the president leads our armed forces, but he does not have the power to declare war. That was something that the European kings and emperors had. So the president may not declare war. He can lead our troops in war or in peace, as the case may be. And the Congress is also responsible for funding the Army, that is, paying for the Army, their food, their supplies, etc. So the president has no power of the purse. So here we see again the brilliance of the Founding Fathers by dividing up the powers. So yes, we have a strong executive, he's the leader of the military forces, but he's hedged in, to use that idea again, that metaphor of the hedge, by Congress. Now, what we're going to see over the course of the 20th century is things get a little confused, things get a little murky. And in fact, if you read in your textbook, the Armed Forces of the United States have been called out over 200 times in our history, but only on 5 distinct occasions has the Congress actually declared war. And I can list those: the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War of 1848, the Spanish-American War of 1898, World War I, 1917, and World War II, 1941. So only 5 times has Congress actually exercised its constitutional authority to declare war. That means then the president, in the other 195 cases, has ordered U.S. troops and or Navy ships into action without Congress in a declaration of war. So does the president have this authority? Well, history tells us yes. The Constitution tells us no. Which is more important, the Constitution or history? And when we talk about history, we really are talking about the idea of precedent. Precedent is actions taken by past presidents that say, hey, you can actually do this. And so that's one of those great questions, because the most recent wars of Iraq and Afghanistan did not involve a U.S. Declaration of war by Congress. It was the president who ordered troops into those areas. Now, Congress was asked for support. Congress was asked to pay or fund those wars. So yes, there was, in some sense, congressional consent, obviously, but there was no formal declaration of war. These are wars that the president, the executive branch, initiated. And that was a trend that began after World War II. We look at Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf War, the island of Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan. All of these conflicts really did not involve a declaration of war, but the president doing so. And so that's really an interesting thing, the expansion of the powers of the president. Let me repeat that, the expansion of the powers of the president. And again, the Founding Fathers kind of set things up, and again, in a way that wasn't really precise. Now, you would think it was fairly precise. Congress declares war, the president's the commander-in-chief. But things over time have not always proven to be so crystal clear. And I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us as we study this in government. But how often in life are things actually as clear as they should be, or as we think they should be? And so we need to be prepared for the unexpected. We need to be prepared for the kind of murky gray edges sometimes that present themselves. So I think there's a valuable life lesson embedded here. So now, in 1973, Congress was kind of resentful of the president's actions into war, and they passed what was called the War Powers Resolution. So 1973, the War Powers Resolution, which said, look, President, if you're going to take American troops and send them into action, you need to let us know within 90 days. So in theory, presidents can fight wars just as long as they don't last more than 90 days, which is never really the case. So again, you can see how Congress has tried to rein in the powers of the president. The presidents have tried to expand their powers. So let's wrap up today with power number 7, and that is the pardon. Article 2, Section 2, he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And you can see up above there's I guess a magician, a Merlin type figure who is granting a pardon with a wand, and then down below you see the famous Monopoly card, get out of jail free. And that kind of looks and is what is going on. The president can in fact pardon people that have been convicted of crimes, found guilty of those crimes, and the president can issue pardons if he feels that there has been an injustice, that is, that there has been an unjust application or judicial interpretation of a law. So one of the most famous pardons in history was President Gerald Ford, who took over for Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, the only president to do so, in 1974, stepping down after the Watergate scandal. Richard Nixon would have been tried in a court of law for having violated, committed crimes on multiple fronts, and President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. Therefore, nobody could try Richard Nixon, the ex-president, for any of the crimes committed while he was president. And he certainly did commit crimes. He would have been convicted. So this set off a furious controversy about the power of the pardon. And many accused Ford of giving his friend, Richard Nixon, a favor. And after all, Richard Nixon had appointed Ford vice president. Richard Nixon's vice president was convicted or would have been impeached for tax evasion and other crimes. So Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon's vice president, resigned. Richard Nixon then, according to the Constitution, appointed Gerald Ford, and then Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. So it's an interesting story. And pardons today have become very politically charged and motivated. So you'll read a little bit more about the president and his powers in chapter 6, section 2 of your textbook, and you got some of those pages, I believe. So we'll be going over some of those details, but please write down any questions, and I hope these lectures are proving useful and valuable to you as we try to work our way through the different branches of government, and in particular the presidency. And I think, again, it's worth also repeating the idea of the scholar Skowronek that I'd mentioned, that the president really is the center of attention. All eyes are on the president. So while we do have a balanced system, 3 branches of government, the president really does stand above and stand out for his actions, his words, his ideas. Though today we see in Washington, in the seat of our national government, a real divide between the Democrats and the Republicans who simply really don't have much patience or tolerance for President Obama and oppose him really at every step of the way when they can. And, the president trying to be the president of all Americans and trying to work with them at times, but also being the leader of the Democratic Party. So you can see some pretty interesting contrasts, some pretty interesting confrontations, and that has led to, some saying, look, we're in a state of gridlock, that's not really good for the country. So we can think about whether the founders did succeed in creating a strong executive, though hedging the powers of the president, and look at how effective government is. So that's something that you guys can think about, how effective government is. And with that, we'll end this video lecture a little bit earlier than the others. Please ask any questions, bring them to class, and we'll try to address those. Thank you very much.